my guy, Cam. So excited to have you back on the show here today. Start off, just give my listeners a little bit about who you are and what you're up to these days.
Sure. Thanks, Mike, and appreciate you having me on. I always love talking to you. Learned a lot from you over the years, so I'm really glad to be here. And just a brief background for me. For anybody who doesn't know who I am, I got into the industry. I was working in private sector for the first 7 years of my career. So I worked for Joe DeFranco, who was really my first mentor and my first coach, because he trained me when I was a high school athlete, college athlete, and I have a lot to thank him for my own physical development. And he sparked my interest in strength conditioning. So I give him a lot of credit for where I went after college and during college. So worked for him for 7 years after I graduated college. Awesome experience. Got to do the whole private sector thing. I know you're all too familiar with that.
Oh, yeah.
And learned a little bit about business, the ups and downs, and how to sell myself and how to sell a program to athletes. And got to work with a ton of different athletes, all different populations, and from youth athletics all the way to the professional ranks and all different kinds of sports. People from all over the world. Joe's name it carries internationally, so it was just a great first place to work and for me to gain experience. And somewhere around between 2015 and 2020, I just started getting the itch to go more into the team side of things. And I played college football, and so I missed that team atmosphere, and I like the idea of just being with one team all year round. And so I decided to leave the private sector and go the college football route. And so I had a brief stint at University of Charlotte at the beginning of 2020. And then in the middle of that, I left and went to Indiana University. So I went and worked with Aaron Wellman there. And I was there for 3 seasons. And that was an amazing experience working with Aaron Wellman, who I got to know him when I was in New Jersey at DeFranco's.
Oh, yeah.
And he was at the New York Giants at the time.
Yeah.
And it's funny because he's now back at the New York Giants. So he went right back to working in there, and so they obviously have a lot of respect for him over there. But that experience of working for a guy who had been at high level colleges, working in the NFL, back to high level college, it was great experience working for him. I learned a lot from him, and
for sure
made the decision at the end of 2022 to move to Auburn University. So I'm now in my second season at Auburn. I'm working for Dom Sadzinski here, who's our head guy, and so Dom was a guy I'd gotten to know just as colleagues and as friends, and he called me with the opportunity, and I already knew what he stood for, what he was about with programming, and it was just an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And so I'm now in my second season at Auburn, and just really excited about where everything's going here.
Yeah, I love it. So for those listening, whenever I do one of these shows, I generally ask, what's going on with you, to the person that's coming on, the guest. Say, what's going on with you? What are you excited about? All that good stuff. And one of the things you mentioned was you're working on a PhD. Talk to me about that, dude. What's your PhD on, and what made you want to go back and do that?
Oh man, it's a lot of work.
I know. That's why I asked, dude. I've looked into it. It's a lot of work.
So there's a lot of days where I'm like, why did I get myself into this? But it's really for me, I wanted to investigate things a little bit more thoroughly. And I figured it was something I was going to be doing anyway. So I might as well get a degree for it. And so, and what's cool about a PhD is you get to really research what you want to research. It's less so, when you're getting your undergrad or a master's, you have all these different classes you need to take. And you sort of slowly trend towards what you actually want to study, where the PhD, It's really like, what do you want to research? And so, I reached out to another mentor of mine, Dr. J.B. Marin, who's out of France.
Yeah.
And I asked him his opinion on what he thinks I should do for possibly getting a PhD. I just didn't really know what to do or how to go about it. And he said, well, I have an opening with me, and I can be your I can be your supervisor if you want to basically attend my university from abroad. And so that's what I did. And so I became enrolled at Jean Monnet University, which is out of Saint Etienne in France. And it's great. So JB is my primary supervisor. I'm doing everything abroad. And so everything I'm doing with my studies in terms of speed and biomechanics, and really the whole project is going to be based on better understanding sprint performance in American football, because that's the sport with which I work. And it was great because not only did I get JB as a primary supervisor, but we asked Dr. Ken Clark
Oh
to
yeah.
be a co-supervisor.
Wow.
And so Ken is my other supervisor. So
Oh
it's
my
just
gosh, dude, that's like Mount
yeah,
Rushmore, man. Those guys are killing it,
I
dude.
know. So for me to be able to be a part of that team, it was just, again, it's like extremely blessed. Couldn't pass it up for anything.
Yeah.
And so the days where I'm stressing over the work that goes into it, I have to remind myself of the opportunity that I'm in this position working with these names and these, I mean, top researchers in anything speed research.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable just the depth and wealth of knowledge that they have and what they're teaching me. And I'm a sponge. I'm trying to absorb it all, and I'm a blank slate. I don't know how to do any of this stuff. So, it's I'm almost like faking it till I make it. I kind of joke, but
Right.
but I'm learning so much, and I'm really learning about how to read research, interpret research, and do research. So it's a great process right now, and I'm really excited about it.
Dude, you are a savage. Because, yeah, there's been a handful of times. Every time I talk to somebody like you, I'm like, oh, man, I should do that. And then I start thinking logistically, like, that's a lot of work, man. I
Yeah,
better really, like, carve out some time if I'm going to make that happen.
well, it's funny because people are like, "How long until you're done?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I have no idea because I'm working this full time job. Working football in the SEC is like
Right.
you got no free time, and so I'm just at a snail's pace, whatever I can chip away in terms of how I'm approaching this PhD project. But I hope in the next 3 years I'm done.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's awesome. So, obviously, that's what I want to talk to you about today. A lot of speed stuff. That's obviously your focus, your passion. And what I want to start with is I would love to get like a then versus now, right? So, obviously, you trained under DeFranco. You've been training for a long time. I would love to hear how you would describe your speed training philosophy like 10 years ago, right? Like, what was your elevator pitch versus what is it now?
Yeah, it's a great question because 10 years ago I would have been basically 1 year removed from my undergrad,
Yeah.
and so at that time the whole reason I dove into speed is because I saw that it was just this hole that needed to be filled in the
Mm-hmm.
industry. It was
Yep.
just, especially in team sport and especially in college football, it was just something that as a player in college football, we weren't doing a lot of it. And it just seemed like it was mostly track and field that was doing it. Not a lot of sports were focusing too much. It was, Olympic lift, do your heavy lifts and get out of the weight room. Basically, everything was weight room based or extensive running, right? So
Right.
literally strength and conditioning.
Right.
And I was fortunate at DeFranco's. I had a coworker and colleague and also a mentor who I interned with, Mike Wadango, who he started kind of turning me on more towards some of the Charlie Francis stuff, and he was learning a lot of stuff from his internship that he had done with Buddy Morris and James
Mm-hmm.
Smith at Pittsburgh at the time. And he was just telling me about all of it. And so, like I said, I like to be a sponge and absorb things. And I was just curious. So I dove into that whole world of Charlie Francis's work and trying to understand sprint training. And for anybody who's new to sprint training, I always recommend Charlie Francis because it's so
Yeah.
digestible and easy to understand for the
sure.
newcomer. And you get such a good base knowledge of how to handle the nervous system and intensive versus extensive training and all of that. And so, but 10 years ago, my thought was like, great, if I just get guys to sprint, then they'll be superhuman, So it was like,
Right.
so I just didn't understand the intricacies associated with actually developing speed and understanding the adaptations of how to integrate it within the whole training system. And so I figured it was
Right.
like plug and play, like just do some sprints and these guys will go from running 4.940s to 4.440s. And it's not that easy, right? It's very complicated and complex. But I think back on about 10 years ago, like my first group of pro day athletes I was training and I read in a book, you can do flying sprints to get somebody faster. And I just said, yeah, let's go rip some flying sprints. And guys were pulling hammies and it was a mess, right?
Yeah.
And so that also taught me to respect the intensity of sprint training.
Yes.
And how to ramp it up. And also just, again, integrating it with everything else and understanding stress. And so over the last 10 years, that's where I've tried to narrow my focus is understanding all of the underlying capabilities associated with getting somebody faster or just improving their nervous system to operate faster, which is really what it is.
Right.
And so that's kind of where my mindset is now especially with team sports is how do I get them to do the most important sport qualities
Yes.
faster,
Yes.
or just to operate faster. And so speed is multifaceted. It could be acceleration, could be top speed, could be just quickness, could be reactive ability. So it could be processing speed. And so that's where my mind has shifted over the last 10 years, is understanding that more of that global approach to everything.
Yeah. No, I love that. And, one of the things that I don't think people totally understand, like, yeah, Charlie gives you such a great foundation, but he was training sprinters, right?
Yeah.
And so
Mm-hmm.
for what you're trying to do with a football player, if it's a pro day or a combine, okay, there's specific skills you have to learn and integrate there. And if you're training a football player, speed is just one physical component or one physical quality that you have to emphasize, right? And so it's a lot more diverse than just, hey, let's just train speed. You have to build the entire athlete, not just speed.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So something that I'm interested in, because I know like one of the buzzwords right now is there's a lot of people talking about fascial athletes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's numerous ways you can classify it. Wide versus narrow ISAs. Some people would call them gorillas and kangaroos, or strength versus elastic dominant. Is that kind of the way that you're approaching it in football? Because I do a lot of basketball training. I get a handful of football players, but nowhere near the volume that you're seeing. So how are you guys kind of like physically breaking these guys down, or trying to say this is this kind of athlete?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I do believe there's merit to it, and I do believe it's something that the field needs to hone in on a little bit more. And because I've been hearing that for a couple of years of just, is this guy fascially driven, muscularly driven, right? And
Right.
so I didn't quite understand what it all meant until I started trying to better understand fascia and elasticity in general. And to me, it's really, if you're somebody who's like super muscularly driven, the way that I understand it, the way that I interpret it, is that you're relying a lot on the pure muscular strength to power your movements.
Yes.
And a lot of people think like, well, yeah, muscles move bones and move the body, so of course it's going to be muscularly driven. But this idea of the elastic components and the fascial elements is a little bit more foreign. It's not traditionally taught in exercise science and kinesiology, and so but to me, there's something there that we're missing, or we're not focusing on. And so the example I always give is, because everybody knows it, is the Ben Johnson versus the Carl Lewis analogy, right? Where that's the perfect dichotomy of muscle driven versus fascial driven, right?
Absolutely.
And so a lot of people, they read the Charlie Francis work and what he did with Ben Johnson, and they gravitate towards, man, he was super strong, really jacked and muscular, just really powerful through all of that. He was just a workhorse. And then they understand that Carl was a guy who, I think there's a quote from Carl where he literally says, I didn't lift weights at all until the last year of my career.
Yeah.
And we tend to ignore all of that because we just think of him as this outlier, like whatever, like Carl didn't lift weights. But we're not paying attention to the fact that he was running just as fast as Ben Johnson, or obviously Ben Johnson won the race at that one point, but you're talking about a guy that I think Carl has like over 9 Olympic gold medals or something like that in various athletics. And so, I mean, how is that possible, right? This guy didn't lift weights, like literally didn't lift weights.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So what is it that's driving that? And so I saw a presentation from Bill Parisi, because he's got these books on fascia that he's coming out with now, and it was at CSCCA last year, and it was really good. And it was about all of this stuff, and he gave the example of 2 different high jumpers, where one outperformed the other in terms of actually doing the high jump event, which is a more elastic dominant event. It's about it's bouncing and getting over this bar through an elastic ground contact type of motion, right? And so, but he gave the analogy about how they're pretty neck and neck in terms of how high they could jump over the bar. But if they just stood there and did a vertical jump, I think one jumped almost 10 inches higher than the other one. Because standing there and just jumping as high as you can, where time is not a factor. Now you're able to utilize more muscle. So one was clearly more muscle driven than the other, right? And so, but when it comes to something more elastic, they can perform similarly. So to me, it's amazing to think about fascia and elasticity, because I think of it as it's this force amplifier that we can develop. And we need to understand it the same way we understand developing muscle. So if we can understand how to develop the connective tissues of, like your tendons and your fascia and all the other series elastic components that go in and coincide with the muscle, then what we're able to do is we're able to build athletes who can perform tasks with the same power output in ways that are significantly more efficient, because utilizing muscle is costly.
Absolutely.
And so if I can utilize these more passive structures that actually give me elastic energy, free energy, basically, and I can teach my athlete to coordinate that in conjunction with the muscular strength he or she does have, it's free stuff. It's free superpowers, So.
Yeah. Well, and the way I try and help people understand it too is like you said, it's metabolically costly. Well, okay, if you're playing a sport where conditioning can be a factor, do you want to use the metabolically costly avenue if you have to, or do you want to rely on, like you said, free energy where you're just not going to fatigue nearly as fast? And so most people don't think about it from a conditioning perspective. But I mean, I always come back to, all the great stuff that you get from it here, but hey, if I can give you the superpower of not fatiguing like the other people are, I feel like that's an added advantage as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've felt it personally, because I used to run where I would basically hamstring curl the ground just to go forward.
Yeah.
When we would do our 110 test, 16 110s in college when I was playing football, and it would fry my hamstrings for 3 days afterwards. Like,
right.
I never actually pulled or tweaked my hamstring, but it was just the tightness and the soreness I got just from running these 110s in a muscular fashion, where I would see my other teammates who are more your typical elastic, fascially driven gazelle type of runners.
Right.
And they're just bouncing down the turf, and we'd go practice later in the day and they were fine, where I could barely walk, know? And so, but now I've taught myself how to run with more elasticity, and I almost never feel the same feeling that I had back then. So I'm like, man, I wish I had this when I was playing,
Right. Versus, who's the guy for the Chiefs? Is it Pacheco? Is that his name? Who runs like he's like mad at the ground? That's what I think of, right? It's like these guys that are like muscularly driven, they're great accelerators, right? But again, it's finding that balance. And something else that you mentioned, when you're talking about Carl Lewis and how he didn't really use weights until the end, I think this has been one of the biggest shifts for me personally, is not just thinking of strength as a driver of outputs, right? Like you alluded to, speed is a great way, and we'll talk more about that later, about as a way to enhance and prime the nervous system. But I've almost shifted my thinking to where strength is more of a protective element, right? And trying to keep these guys healthy, especially these fascially elastic driven creatures, because they are so bouncy and so elastic, they need some of that strength training to help support those tissues.
Agreed. And so to me, when I think about football and college football, it's a great sport for this, because you have really three broad groups of positions, right?
Yeah.
So like we have our guys who are really big and they're up front, the linemen, the offensive and defensive line. And for those guys, it's a lot of muscle driven work, a lot of just, I got to overpower this guy across from me, and I take 2 steps and I got to push through this guy. And you have all the way on the other side of the spectrum, you have your wide receivers and your defensive backs, where now these guys are a lot more in terms of just general athletic ability. They need a lot more. They do need a lot more of that elasticity, that bounciness, just the ability to coordinate in space significantly more than the guys up front. And then you have your mids or your big skill positions that are more in the middle, and they need a little bit of both, because they're going to have to collide with people a lot, but then they also need to be athletic enough to keep up with some of these more perimeter skill-based positions. And so it's a great sport for me to just sort of understand how all these things come together, because they fit so well along that spectrum of, as a position, like what needs to be more muscularly driven versus something that might be more fascially driven. Yeah. And so it is fascinating to study it that way. And that's exactly how I'm doing it in my PhD work, is I'm breaking them up into these groups. And it's, when you do it that way, you actually start to see trends that make sense intuitively, but it's just, there's not enough research out there that's promoting it. And so I'm trying to help do that. And so, it's just better ways to understand how to train the position, instead of just thinking everybody needs the same thing. But, at the same time, understanding everybody's human. And like you said, even if I know this guy needs a ton of more of that elastic reactive type of work, I still I can't neglect the fact that he does need some level of strength to balance all that out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I would love, I don't know how deep you can go into this, because obviously we don't want to go like dive into your research, like make that an issue. But like, I would love to hear just a little bit more, like how you're maybe teasing this out a little bit and how you might distinguish between your big guys in the middle, your wide guys. Like, how are you refining and implementing some of the speed work to give them more of what they need?
yeah, I think a really simple way to talk about it, because this is just some of the first things I'm seeing in the research, and we're hoping to publish this first paper here pretty soon. But basically, this first paper is just focusing on how do these guys sprint and what are the outputs that they do. And so
Okay.
we're looking at measures of like velocity and top speed, and we're looking at horizontal force output, which is essentially their rate of acceleration.
Yep.
And then we're looking at horizontal power. So these are all your kinetic outputs with some of those factors there. And then we're also looking at the kinematics. So what we did is we sprint tested them, and we measured the velocity, we measured the sprint times, we did all of that. But then we also filmed them, and we were able to extrapolate some kinematic data, their joint positions, their ground contacts, and all of that stuff. So we're combining it all together. And just from a basic sprint test, what are we seeing from each position, and what is it that seems to be important for their relative acceleration performance? And it's funny because they basically all did the same test. The exception would be that the linemen, because of what you said, the risk to reward ratio there, we had them sprint 20 meters, whereas we had everybody else sprint 30 meters in terms of just doing this basic linear sprint test. And so some interesting things came out of there. So if we just think about horizontal force, or just my ability to produce force in the horizontal direction, right? Everybody's very familiar with the vertical plane, because that's the weight room. How much strength do I need, relative strength, if I'm doing a squat or a deadlift or something like that, right? Well, there's also the horizontal plane that we can overload that as well. So things like heavy prowler pushes, or heavy sled drags, or just heavier resisted sprints, or lighter resisted sprints. There's a whole spectrum of loading the horizontal plane. If we just think about horizontal force, what we found, or what we're finding, I should say, because it's not published yet, but what we're starting to see is that the linemen, they seem to rely a lot more on that horizontal force, because the metric that we use for horizontal force is the F0, as it were. So it's like a theoretical maximum force, but it's newtons per kilogram. So it's like force per unit of body mass. And so basically it's mass specific force. And so what we're finding is that for those guys, they need a lot more of that relative strength, so to speak, in the horizontal direction, just to get their big bodies going, right?
Yes.
And so a lot of people with the horizontal force research think, okay, that's important for everybody. And if you looked at the entire group collectively, we would find, yes, it does seem to be important for everybody. But when we break them up group by group, so your linemen, your big skill positions, so that would be like your linebackers, your tight ends, and some of those positions there. And then your skill players, which are like your wide receivers, your defensive backs. And we put the running backs in there because the running backs were so fast.
Right.
It's funny because this mass specific force, so my relative strength in the horizontal direction, super important for the linemen, really important for the big skill as well, although less so than the linemen. But for the skill positions, almost not really that important. Because it was very interesting to see where it's just there wasn't a lot of large significant correlations or relationships with the skill position group. So your wide receivers, your defensive backs, and your running backs, not a huge relationship there in terms of how they are able to perform their acceleration. And so they relied more on the velocity capabilities. And so if you looked at the measures of velocity, those had large significant relationships with the skill players, a little bit less so for the big skill, and not as much for the linemen. So it's like, it's almost, again, this inverse sort of spectrum there, where I think what it is that the skill players are just, the body mass is so much smaller relative to the linemen.
Yes.
I mean, you're talking about 100 pounds lighter of a human being, right?
Easily.
So, and because it's so much lighter, it's just, they don't need quite as much just strength to get that body going. But once that body's going, they got to pick up and get that thing going. So if you think about power as being the combination of force and velocity, or the product of force and velocity, I should say. It was very clear for every position, even when you broke it up by positions, that horizontal power is everything. It's the same thing in the vertical plane. Like it's never just about strength, or it's about just how can I maximize power, right? I need to get my athletes as powerful as possible. Same thing in the horizontal direction. Maximize horizontal power as best you can, but the way in which you do that, it seems that it's better served to train linemen to gain more power through more force-oriented work, and
Yep.
vice versa for the skill players. It's like give them enough force to get them going
Yeah.
where they don't have a
Yeah.
detriment in there, but after that, it's like get that thing going from the speed side of things, and that's really going to get them to take the top off there. And so it's really interesting stuff because it's going to hopefully provide some insight into what we need to do training wise to better maximize the adaptations for that position. And so you always have two different layers. You got the position group in which they play, and then the individual within that. So yeah, if I'm a skill
Yeah.
guy, if I'm a skill player and I look at my individual profile and it's showing I still need a little bit more horizontal force, I got to develop that. Same thing if I'm weak in the weight room or something like that. But
Yeah.
it seems everybody talks about the weight room where it's like there's a certain point where strength isn't going to help me out as much anymore. It's the same thing with the
Yep.
horizontal plane. Like there's just if I keep going in heavy sleds and doing that forever, at some point it's not going to help my speed anymore if I'm a skill player. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
No, that's awesome. Well, and here's the great thing, right? Is everybody talks about bucketing athletes, right? And intuitively, everything you're discussing makes sense. But it's one thing to bucket, and it's another to kind of have like a model, right? And it sounds like that's what you guys are trying to do is like, okay, not just can I bucket them, but hey, here's like an acceptable range. And then if you've got that, now that makes it that much easier to dive in and really say, okay, this person is force deficient, so we need more weight room work, or we need those, horizontal sleds and prowler works to really help top them off and get them where they need to be. That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because one of JB's colleagues, Pierre Samazino, he was really good with the force velocity profiling in the vertical plane, and he's been super important for the research on the horizontal plane as well. But he was able to show in the vertical plane that there is an optimal relationship for each individual in terms of how their force and velocity coincide with each other. And it has to do with underlying capabilities of force output and body structure, if my legs are longer versus
Sure.
shorter and things like that, which becomes more important to just get myself to project off the ground and counteract gravity.
Yes.
And it was a lot simpler for him to do that in the vertical plane because everybody's just got to go up against gravity. When
Right.
it comes to horizontal sprinting, you can have various distances associated with it. And so there is not one optimal profile or slope between your force and velocity capabilities that would coincide with just every sprint performance. It's more dependent upon the distance in which you need to cover. And so
Mm.
he had a paper about that where he showed that the slope changes depending on what distance I need to maximize. And so if we think about, just for simplicity's sake, if I'm a lineman, really I need to maximize my first 10 yards, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if I'm more of a big skill player, I really need to maximize somewhere between 10 and 20 yards. And then if I'm a skill guy
Yeah.
and I'm a wide receiver, maybe I got to take the top off. So I got to perhaps maximize out to more 30 yards or longer. And so obviously
Yep.
the further you go, the more optimal slope becomes more velocity oriented, right? So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it coincides with a lot of his work as well. What we're finding just based on what these players are asked to do and just the underlying qualities that they need in order to make that happen.
Yeah. It's just really cool because it's one thing for it to intuitively make sense, and it's another to be able to take it and use it to drive real programming, right?
Yeah.
And have concrete numbers to work with. So that's awesome. Okay, something else I want to talk to you about because we talked about this prior to the show. I feel like we've kind of mentioned it a little bit here, but I think we're in the same camp here of kind of shifting away from the weight room strictly as our only tool to develop physical outputs, right? And I think you and I both came up in a certain day and age where it's like you took pride in your weight room numbers and you really felt like your weight room numbers were going to carry over to your speed and your athleticism. And I'll be honest, full disclosure, for a while I thought, everybody that just chirps on speed were just track people. It's like, oh, the track people keep talking about speed to develop the nervous system. But, like to admit that I'm probably wrong on that. And I feel like speed is such a critical way to develop the nervous system. I know you feel the same way. So I'd love to hear, number one, what kind of shifted your thinking on this? And then number two, some ways that you're maybe using speed development to really prime the nervous system and make your athletes more explosive.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think where my mind goes with it now, because I'm blessed to have such a great collection of colleagues. that all have different thoughts, and it's a
Yeah.
smorgasbord of ideas that are basically in my contact list in my phone, right? So I can,
Yeah.
if I need to know something about this or that, I pick up the phone, I call this guy, or he can at least refer me to somebody else, or she can refer me to
Yep.
somebody else. And I try to find the common denominator. So like Dan Paff's a really good mentor of mine, and just he talks about common denominators. Okay, what are the things that seem to pop up everywhere? Whether you're talking about speed, or you're talking about strength, or power, or jumping, or sprinting, or change of direction, right? And the most common denominator for me is the nervous system. Like that's the thing that, whether I'm talking about muscle hypertrophy or I'm talking about perceptual cognitive speed on the pitch or on the field where I'm playing in a
Yeah.
game, right? It's all based on what's my brain doing, what's my nervous system doing, and how is it activating the rest of my body? How is it communicating with my body through hormones? How is it communicating with my body through muscle activation or rate coding and intermuscular
Yeah.
coordination and all of these things that we've always thought about when we go through our textbooks and exercise science, right? But
Right.
um, are we appreciating that system and how governing that system really is?
Yeah.
And tied into that are things that are outside of our brain in terms of things that are not conscious, so unconscious control of movements or reflexive control of movements, but it's all based on the health of that system. And so
Yep.
I think if we try to overdrive the system in one area versus another too much, we can perhaps overdo it, and we can
Yeah.
then, at the very least, we can throw off the system, so to speak. And so
Yep.
this is something where I'm just really trying to get a better understanding of adaptation in general. So when I think about where college football is going, and when I think about the NFL, it's almost like those who understand how to make the system adapt the most optimally and the fastest are going to have the most success in our field.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
talk about the greatest ability is availability and all these buzz phrases associated with just
Yep.
keeping guys on the field and performing at a high level. Well, it's one thing to get them out there; it's another one to have them out there and performing at a high level. So, how do we do that?
Yes.
How do we ensure his system is functioning as best as possible? And so, to me, it's about understanding adaptation and all that goes into that. What are short term adaptations, long term adaptations, chronic, acute, all these different words. And to me, with the nervous system, that's got to be priority number one. I've got to take care of that system. And if I decide to overreach that system at any point, I need to understand how to get it back. You know,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
one coach who I think is fascinating, where he talks about it, is Coach Boo Schexnayder.
Mm.
Good
Yep.
track and field coach, and he'd been at LSU, a number of places, and hearing him talk is incredible because he speaks from such great experience. And he
Absolutely.
had a presentation for Altus where he talked about how his program, as it progressed more towards the in season, he would actually start with a power phase. He wouldn't start with a strength phase because he
Mm.
wanted to keep weights more submax, get them moving faster, activate the system, prime the system to be reactive and responsive,
Right.
right? And then he would go into more of a strength phase where, in his mind, the nervous system was already primed for firing up the muscles. So he felt like I can get more out of my force dominant adaptations now because the nervous system's ready to activate. So I can actually make that
Mm.
muscle contract harder when I'm trying to get my strength adaptations. But then he knew he had to get out of it in time for the phases leading up into the competitive part. Because if
Right.
he kept heavy work in there for too long, like super heavy strength work, we'll say over 80%, up to 100% of 1RM, if he kept that in too long, he found that his athletes were actually becoming uncoordinated, or they were
Yes.
they were, they
Yes.
were
I've heard him say that.
right. So they were losing the
Yeah.
ability to perform what we talked about before, like these fascially driven movements, these elastic movements. So, and Dan Paff talks about it too. A number of track coaches talk about it. Is you lose elasticity, you lose coordination when you're just driving the system for force, and slow force, if that.
Right.
And so he
Right.
knew I need that in there to touch on it and make sure it stays present. But then I need to
Yes.
get away from it so that it doesn't affect my competitive season. So it's really fascinating in terms of understanding coordination. And so the viewpoint about all that is just different than how we've traditionally been brought up,
Yeah.
and I think a lot about Bosch's book about strength training and coordination and how he
Sure.
put those two together. And to me, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Is you have people who are so just physiologically biased, and then you have other people who are coordination biased, and it's like, what's the balance between those two? You know?
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
yeah,
Yeah. I think that's been one of the biggest things for me. And look, I can admit my bias here because most of the athletes that I've worked with over the past 5 or 6 years are, while not a finished product, like their outputs are already kind of there, so I don't have to chase the outputs. Like you alluded to, it's more touching the outputs somewhere in the off season, right? Making sure that we top the system off and that it's there. But we don't have to like push the adaptations versus like you, whether you're in high school or like especially the younger college athletes, they are not finished products. And so that's where you have to find times where you push the system, you overreach a little bit because you still need those physiological adaptations, right? They're not complete yet, and you have to do that to help them get to the apex or the peak of their athleticism.
absolutely. And JB Moran, my PhD supervisor, he talks about the toothpaste tube analogy, where you get a young athlete, it's a full tube of toothpaste. No matter where you squeeze that tube, toothpaste is going to come out. But as you get later and later in the career, you got to figure out different ways to get toothpaste out of that tube, And so it's a really fascinating analogy. But I also think about going back to Bush Exnader. He would talk about his track athletes, where he's like, if they were in a developmental stage with me, they might be doing heavy squat work or heavy strength work for 4 months. But if they're at the point where they're an advanced athlete in my program, they might only do heavy strength work for 4 total weeks. So it's really interesting. And it coincides with that toothpaste tube analogy.
Well, and here's just a great little nugget. If you coach young people, don't feel like you have to get into all the sexy stuff right away, right?
Exactly.
Because like you alluded to, full tube of toothpaste, like you don't have to use like triple block periodization, triphasic training, like all the cool buzzy stuff right off the bat. Like just get them in the gym, let them train, let them develop. And then when you need that stuff, it's there, right? Versus if you use up all the cool stuff right away, now the body isn't going to respond to that adaptation the way you'd like 10 years down the line when they actually need it.
Yeah, I agree fully. And when I think back to my time in the private sector, what I wish I had done as well is take my time with certain things like maximum strength. Because if you have an athlete who's literally never been under a barbell before, just putting 45 pounds on their back is theoretically it's overload, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
So do I need to like rush to get them to a 315 squat or a 225 bench? I don't think so. So to me, that's where I think I'm more trending towards that bias of coordination first, nervous system first, because I think if I, even with a young athlete, if I overshoot it too quickly, sure, maybe I'll get him to lift that thing, but I wonder what's happening from a nervous system and coordination standpoint, where I can probably get away with taking my time with that, as long as along the way it's like we're making sure everything's moving well, it's smooth. If it looks right, it flies right, kind of thing, as Charlie Francis used to say. So I think that there's like the bell curve sort of analogy is definitely true, where don't try to get to the top of that curve right away. Take your time, get yourself there, and then start to figure out when you can taper back down and focus on other qualities. So that's the way I think about it now.
I love it. Man, and maybe I've been misquoting that because I use that quote all the time. I always give credit to Dan Pfaff. Maybe I need to say Charlie Francis and Dan Pfaff.
I don't know.
I mean, who knows, right? Both legends.
I think
both legends. I don't think I can go wrong.
It was one or the other.
So. Yeah. Okay, so one other topic I would love to talk to you about is hamstring pulls. And this is something that I really dove deep into for like 10 years because I started off in soccer for a long time. It's a big deal, right? I mean, a bad hamstring pull, 2 to 3 months, and that could be half of your season, right? In your world, that could be almost your entire season. Mm-hmm. So maybe just for starters, like what got you excited or what made you want to start learning more about hamstring pulls?
I think it was my interest in speed and realizing that there was this connection between hitting very high velocities and pulling hamstrings. I mean, it's the reason why a lot of coaches are afraid to do speed work, is they just don't want to pull hamstrings. And so now you have this other side of the equation where there's a lot of research to support the fact that also not exposing them to that speed can put them at risk of hamstring strain, because at some point they might experience it. And so it's better to touch on it in a controlled setting before they have to do it in a chaotic setting. And so I think they refer to that as the vaccination effect or creating a vaccine effect. And so to me, it's and like I said, early in the career when I was putting guys through speed training, I had guys pull hamstrings, and so I'm like, well, what's that about? What's going on there? And so I think for me, a lot of it goes back to the muscle driven versus fascial driven, because I think that a lot of the hamstring issues when it comes to high speed movements, it's because the hamstring is probably operating more in a muscular regime than in an elastic regime. And so when you're at such high speeds, you think about the classic line of like you're getting up to 10 times your body weight of vertical force into the ground in like a tenth of a second. You know what I mean? And so clearly that's an elastic environment. It's a ton of force, very, very minimal time. The only way you can do that is really in a predominantly elastic environment. And so going back to some of the Franz Bosch stuff, I think one of the topics he talks about in his book that fascinates me is this argument of, is it eccentric? Is it isometric? Like, how is the hamstring operating at maximum speed? But I don't know. I'm not here to help alleviate that argument. But I think something that he says seems to resonate with me and what I see and what I understand to be true in terms of how things happen in person and when I'm coaching is basically like if that hamstring muscle is too weak to resist all of that force that happens on ground contact and do so in a way that coordinates properly with the surrounding tissues. So again, talking about utilizing my fascia, utilizing my tendons and all the other components of that series elastic component and calling upon this free energy. If I don't have the coordination to do that and my muscle is not strong enough to withstand all that force, then what it'll probably do is deform excessively. And so it might overstretch or overstrain, at which point it can possibly rupture. And so, and it's obvious because people want to argue against that, but let's just think about the fact that clearly the hamstring alone is not meant to handle that much force. Like, if I'm 200 pounds and you're talking about 10 times your body weight of force, there's no way in hell I can go on a prone hamstring curl machine and leg curl on one leg 2,000 pounds.
Especially in that amount of time, right?
Right. So obviously we know like the hamstring alone it can't possibly handle all that load by itself. And so it's more proof of the fact that it's elastic. You've got to call upon these other tissues that can help dissipate that load or share in that loading, or else the hamstring is going to take on more than it can handle. And it's going to rupture. And so that's where I feel like my analogy before, or my example before of when I was doing 110s and my hamstrings are getting blown up, I was using the muscle too much, and so that's where I think the issue is, like I said before, it's something where you're training your posterior chain to operate too muscularly, which is an interesting way to think about it, instead of elastically like it should be at high speed. And so to me, a lot of it is also based on you can protect yourself with posture and position. And so for me, it's pelvic control and how important that is. And that's the main thing that I see, and the main thing that I've written about in some articles is the anterior pelvic tilt and the duck butt position. And my chest is pointed forward and my hips are pointed towards the ground. Like I'm overextending my low back, all of these things. And so Jordan Mendeguccia, I love his research because he's basically like the hamstring guy right now. Yeah, and he's doing a ton of great work out of Spain, and he's part of JB's crew. Like they're good colleagues with each other, and it's the hamstring stuff is something we'd like to get into in my research. We'll see if we can make it happen. But the paper that he just came out with this year of how basically for every 5 degrees of anterior pelvic tilt that I have, the biceps femoris, which is the hamstring muscle that strains most frequently, it stretches about 0.4, almost half an inch at the proximal level. And so so the closer to the glute, that's where it's really stretching when I overextend. So if I had like 20 degrees of pelvic tilt where my hips are really pointed towards the ground, you're talking about almost stretching that muscle tendon unit 2 inches more than it needs to be. So it's already overstretched before you even touch the ground as it's cycling through. And so just your pelvic position alone can cause excessive deformation if it's not in a more neutralized position and something that's more effective to put that elastic load into the ground. And it's the other thing about the example I give our players all the time is I literally stand there and I overarch and I try to drive my knee as high as I can, and it's not very high. My foot's literally like 2 to 4 inches off the ground. I'm like, look at how much room I have to put power into the ground when I do this. Versus if I put my pelvis in a more neutral posture, now my foot's almost 2 feet off the ground. Like I have that much more room to just put force on the ground and bounce, right? And so to me, that position is the pelvic position is huge, and just being able to control the pelvis and in terms of keeping that hamstring healthy, it's just there just seems to be more and more proof coming out about that. So yeah, it needs more research, but it's big time, I think.
Dude, I'm just so glad you mentioned this, because if you go back, listeners, go back, Google Mike Robertson hamstrings. I guarantee I was talking about this, right? Because nobody was talking about pelvic position. And I'm like, look, I can't say like one for one, but these people that have massive anterior pelvic tilts, they're more likely to pull hamstrings. So we always put a huge emphasis. And look, I'm never going to tell you it's one thing. You know as well as I do, it's not like one thing.
Correct.
But it's part of like a holistic approach.
Yes.
Right? Okay, let's get the pelvis back underneath them. Let's make sure we're dosing in some high velocity sprint training. Let's make sure we're training the hamstrings at both ends. Like, there's a lot of things that go into this, but not enough people were talking about that, right? Because it's such a low-level thing, something you can control very easily if you put time and energy into it. So I just love that you're talking about that and making that an emphasis.
Agreed, yeah. And I'm of the bias and belief that pelvic position plays into a lot of other things, too. It'll play into the way I change direction and the stresses my knee has to accrue when I do that. So I think it's one of those simple things that it has such global impact on performance is just teaching my system how to better coordinate my pelvis.
Yes, preach, man. Okay, one more topic, and then I promise I'll let you go. Staying on the topic of hamstrings, right? I feel like there's very much this love-hate with Nordics, right? And forever, Nordics were like the cure to everything hamstring, and now there's a lot of hate coming out on Nordics. I have always felt they are a part of just like a global approach to keeping hamstrings healthy, but I would just love to hear your thoughts of the role and potential value of having Nordics, or lack thereof, of having Nordics in your program.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's something I continue to review every day, but like I'm of the belief that there's no bad exercise, there's no amazing exercise. I think it's a tool for a problem in this moment, in this time. And so I think a lot of the arguments are based around, is the hamstring operating eccentrically at top speed? Is it isometrically at top speed when the foot hits the ground? Can it be somewhere in between? You know what I mean? And so and what I mean by that is, like, if you think about what Alex Natera and some of the isometric researchers refer to as a HIMA, H-I-M-A, like a holding isometric muscle action. To me, that's like, it's shifting and shading a little bit towards being also kind of eccentric, right? Because in a way, what you're doing is like you get yourself into a load and you want to resist excess movement of that load. But I'm not doing on the flip side, doing like a PIMA or pushing isometrically. I'm actually concentrically driving. Whereas a HIMA, I get into the load and I have to make myself not deform. And so like that, if you think about like an eccentric quasi-isometric or EQI, as it were, it's like if I were to go halfway down in a push-up and just try to hold that, and as soon as I lose that ability, I just start dropping towards the ground, like my chest keeps getting closer. So eventually it transitions into that eccentric regime where it's clear and obvious, but it's somewhere on that borderline there, right? And so to me, I think that's, in my personal belief, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm willing to admit it if somebody can prove me wrong, is I think that's what it is when your foot hits the ground. Is it's somewhere between isometric and eccentric. It's something, it's more of like that HIMA kind of contraction. And so, like JB did some work with isokinetic machine strength and all of that. And what he found was that these sprinters who operate at a very high level, they have a ton of glute concentric strength on an isokinetic machine, and then they have a ton of hamstring eccentric strength. So, clearly there's some importance to hamstring eccentric capabilities, right? But I do think that there's a lot with hamstring isometric capabilities too. So I'm totally in line with, there's a place for Nordics, and I think there's a place for some of the hip iso bridges that like Alex Natera made popular, and
Yeah.
I think it all makes sense. But to me, like if I'm doing any form of eccentric or isometric based training, what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to teach the nervous system to fire the muscle more efficiently in some way, shape, or form. It's some kind of activator. And so I think a really interesting paper was one that JB was on and Jordan was on it too, Jordan Mendegucci, about basically comparing sprinting to Nordics. And they found that like the big thing with Nordics is increasing the fascicle length of the hamstring. But they also found that if you just sprint properly, the same adaptation occurs just from sprinting.
Right.
But on the flip side, if I think, okay, all I got to do is sprint now, I don't need to do Nordics. If I'm not sprinting well, or if I'm doing it with a ton of anterior pelvic tilt or whatever, I'm not going to get those positive adaptations that would coincide with the Nordics. So
right.
I've got to sprint properly. So sometimes it's like I can do the Nordic to teach the system how to do that. And then, it's like anything else. Like we talked about before, if I'm doing max strength or weight room based activities are essentially teaching opportunities and activators for athletic based movement. And so the same thing with the isometric work. If I'm doing a hip bridge, I'm essentially trying to train my system to fire that musculature in this way so that I can use it in sport. Otherwise, what the hell am I doing? Why am I doing this? You know what I mean? And so,
right.
So with the Nordics, I think that the same thing applies. Like if I'm not doing Nordics properly, I'm not going to get out of it what I think I'm getting out of it. So if I'm losing my pelvic position on Nordics, am I doing more harm than good? If I'm like kind of inching into it and I just fall on my face, am I doing more harm than good?
Right.
So do I have control over that position and that range of motion? And to me, that's something that's neurally driven. It goes back to coordination. I have to be able to control the position and the range of motion. And so I think that, is it going to cure the hamstring problem? No, because it's just one isolated movement. But is it part of a toolbox that can help? Absolutely.
Yes. I love that. And like you alluded to, there's levels to it, right? So maybe it's starting off with, hey, can you just get in the right position, right? And hold it. And then can you do that through a controlled range of motion? Okay, great. Next level is, can you do all this, but with speed, right? Like being able to catch and stop, right? Now you're getting more on that continuum towards where you want to be. But like you alluded to, it just frustrates me, right? We talked about this before the show, like social media. People love to find like this one little piece of like research or nuance that they want to argue over. It's like, hey man, no one exercise is going to fix all the things.
No.
But understanding where an exercise fits in a global regime or an all-encompassing program gives you now a much more complete way to address some of these issues that we're seeing.
Absolutely. And I would encourage listeners and anybody else to look at Jordan Mendegucci's work, because the way he approaches the problem of hamstring pulls is multifactorial. So he looks at it from it's not just pelvic control. It's not just fascial length. It's not just high speed exposure. It's some level of all of it together. And it's really good work, in my opinion.
I will definitely find whatever he has out there and either like link to like PubMed or ResearchGate, whatever is out there. But yeah, I'll do some of the homework for you guys. You can thank me later. But Cam, dude, man, this is always amazing to catch up. I know you got a lot going on, so I want to be conscious of your time. But where can my listeners find out more about you and all the great work that you're doing?
So really, everything I'm putting out there is on X. I finally stopped calling it Twitter. I've given in. But it's
right.
That's the only social media platform I have at this time. And anything that I'm doing or anything that I'm interested in is I put it up on there. And so as the PhD work comes out and the papers come out and any other work that I'm doing, it'll all go on there. So that's pretty much the primary place to follow anything I'm doing.
Yeah, perfect. I'll make sure I put the links in the show notes so they can find you. And dude, so much respect, man. Everything you're doing, it's hard to walk in both realms. I tried for a couple years at Ball State, being on the research and the applied side, doing it all at the same time. So much respect for what you're doing, man. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. This was great. I really enjoyed being here.